I want to thank Iran Human Rights NGO for organizing this event. And I want to thank all of you who are here and watching online around the world. It's really a huge thing to do a live event for 24 hours. I've never heard of an organization that does that before, that's done that before. And now I have to switch. I have to tell Zoom what language I'm speaking. So just give me a moment. There we go. And I apologize, I don't speak Farsi, so I've been checking in from time to time throughout the day, and I heard a lot of Farsi, but also some German, another language I don't speak. So I hope you'll bear with me that I'll speak in English. In addition to thanking Iran Human Rights, I know they can't hear me right now, but I am so grateful, and we at the Advocates for Human Rights are so grateful for all of the people in the 22 Iranian prisons who are making their voices heard on every Tuesday by engaging in this hunger strike. We know that this is not without risk, and that they are taking this chance to speak out in their own way against the death penalty. And that's a really important message that I have to share, that there's no one solution to get a country, any country, whether it's the United States or Iran or China, there's no one magic solution to getting a country to abolish the death penalty. There needs to be a variety of strategies. So one strategy is the strategy that those people in the prisons are doing this hunger strike. Another strategy is what all of you are doing right now, is amplifying their voices to make sure the world knows what's going on. And another part of that strategy is what I'm going to talk about, which is advocacy at the United Nations. So it's not, there's no single solution, and all of these different strategies are very important for pressing a government to abolish the death penalty. What I'd like to do first, I'll give a little bit of an overview about advocacy at the United Nations and how that works, and then I'll talk more specifically about our advocacy that we've done in collaboration with Iran Human Rights to do that advocacy at the United Nations. But I did take a look back. The Advocates for Human Rights was established in 1983. We did our first report to the United Nations on death penalty issues in Iran in 2011. It's actually the same year I joined the organization, but I wasn't involved with that report. And our first report in collaboration with Iran Human Rights was more than 10 years ago. So as our executive director says at the Advocates for Human Rights, the fight for human rights is not a sprint, it's a marathon. So you take it slowly and you have to pace yourself. So I hope that this presentation will give you a sense of where we've been, what progress we've made, and what's still left to be done, and also what all of you can do to help with this advocacy at the United Nations. If it's okay, I don't know if I'm able to share my screen. Is that a possibility? I have just a couple of slides I wanted to show. I'll give it a try, and if not, then I'll enlist some technical support. So it looks like I can share. So just by way of background, the organization I work for is called the Advocates for Human Rights. It is, as Mr. Rafat said, based in Minneapolis in the United States. And my name is Amy Bergquist, and I think that's pronounced correctly. It's a Swedish name, and I don't speak Swedish, so it sounded correct to me. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and this will be the first part of my presentation, is human rights treaties. Now, human rights treaties are a choice that every country in the world has, is whether to ratify or accede to or adopt a particular human rights treaty. The United States is not very fond of ratifying human rights treaties. The United States has ratified only 3. And you'll see the main 9 human rights treaties up on your screen. The ones that are orange in color are the ones that Iran has ratified. So Iran has ratified the Treaty on Civil and Political Rights, the Treaty on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Treaty on Racial Discrimination, the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, and the Treaty on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The other treaties Iran has not ratified. And because Iran hasn't ratified those treaties, there's not really an opportunity to do advocacy with the UN bodies that work with those particular treaties. And of the 5 treaties that Iran has ratified, I'm going to talk about 4 of them because the Advocates for Human Rights with Iran Human Rights has done advocacy with 4 of the 5 treaty bodies that are on the screen. Those are the ones that are in brighter orange. And the main type of advocacy we've engaged in with these treaties is what's called the periodic reporting process. When a country decides to ratify a treaty, they enter into an agreement. They agree to follow the treaty, whatever it says about human rights, and some countries are better at that than others. And they also agree to participate in a periodic reporting process. What this means is it's kind of like, if you're familiar with financial terms, it's like an audit. And the government itself will do its own self-audit to say, here's how we're doing with the treaty. And then under each treaty, there's also a committee of experts. And those experts specialize in the rights under that particular treaty. So the experts also do a more independent audit of the country's compliance with the treaty. And in that process, there's an opportunity for civil society organizations or non-governmental organizations like Iran Human Rights and the Advocates for Human Rights to give input, so that the experts have all the information they need at their fingertips to conduct their audit. So this next slide will show the cycle of reporting for these different treaty bodies. Each treaty body follows more or less the same pattern for this cycle. The first stage in the reporting cycle is when the government of the country that's ratified the treaty submits its own self-audit, its own report saying, here's what we're doing well, here are the improvements we've made, here are some things we're struggling with, and sharing, disclosing information relevant to the rights in the particular treaty. After that happens, civil society organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and Iran Human Rights can help shape the agenda for the experts to conduct their review. The agenda that the committee sets is called a list of issues. And before the committee comes up with its list of issues, we have the chance to make a written submission to the committee experts to say, please consider placing these issues on your agenda. There are some committees that kind of automatically will put the death penalty on the agenda, but other committees don't necessarily pay attention to it unless civil society gives them information and tells them to put that issue on their radar. So I'll give you examples of both. But after the civil society organizations submit their information, then the committee experts take the information they have, they'll read through the government's report, they'll read through the civil society organizations' submissions, and they will come up with an agenda, that list of issues. And that list of issues will express concern about certain things, share information that the committee has received that the committee would like the government to respond to, and most importantly, will ask questions, will ask for information from the government. Then at the next, so that's step 2 in the process. The next step is for the government to share a written response to that list of issues. So they go through the agenda point by point and answer or don't answer the questions that the committee experts pose. After that government report comes in, that's at stage 3, then civil society organizations get another chance to participate in the process by submitting what we call a shadow report. It's also called an alternative report or parallel report. And that report can kind of fact check what the government has to say. can point out what the government omitted, and can share additional information of relevance to the committee, especially given what the committee has put on the agenda and the information the committee is looking for. So that shadow report can be really important. The next stage in the process is step 4. It's called a constructive dialogue. This happens in Geneva, Switzerland, and the government will send a delegation. I don't remember typically how big the Iranian government delegations are. It's probably at least 10 people, might be as many as 20. They'll send a government delegation to Geneva and meet in a big room with the committee experts. And the government delegation will get a chance to present an oral summary of the state report. And then it's go time. Then it's time for that constructive dialogue. And these committee experts will ask lots and lots of tough questions. So there'll be a round of questions, and then the government experts are supposed to respond orally to those questions. Then there will be follow-up questions and another round of questions. And it goes back and forth for a total of about 6 hours of the committee experts grilling the government and the government providing responses or non-responses to the questions that the committee experts pose. As part of this process in Geneva, there's also a chance for civil society organizations to get involved. We can and do prepare what we call one-pagers, which are summary documents that are a shorter version of the shadow reports and suggested list of issues reports that we submit. It's kind of higher level talking points to help the committee experts focus their attention on particular things. And there are also 2 briefings that the committee experts have with NGOs before that constructive dialogue. The first briefing is public, and it's really kind of a sort of formal. NGOs can make statements, and those statements are typically just like 2 minutes or so. There's typically not time for back and forth, but that's okay. It's just a public session. They will cover multiple countries at the same time. But the really more interesting and more productive briefing is the private closed-door briefing that usually happens right before the constructive dialogue begins. This is a private meeting, and the committee experts typically just have lots and lots of questions for civil society. Can you tell me about this? Does anyone have more information about that? And so it's a lot of back and forth, sort of last minute cramming for the committee experts to get ready for that constructive dialogue. It can be super helpful, and sometimes they ask questions that civil society organizations don't know the answers to. They're phoning a friend, reaching out, and they typically will say, you can give us written responses within 12 or 24 hours. There's another chance to follow up to make sure those experts have the information they're looking for. And sometimes the information is just not available, and we tell the committee experts that, like, we can't get that information. Perhaps you, as experts at the United Nations, can press our government to share that information. When the constructive dialogue begins, I should also add, because I'm guessing that people in your audience are all around the world, the constructive dialogue itself is live webcast on UN Web TV. So you can tune in real time, or probably 6 to 8 hours later, they'll post the archive video on the UN Web TV website. So you can go and watch this constructive dialogue and see how it goes. And that can be really enlightening to see how the Iranian government responds to questions, how they present certain issues, and what types of questions those experts are really focusing on. But also during that constructive dialogue, for NGOs that have a chance to be in Geneva, there's a chance during breaks, for example, to pull a committee expert aside and to say, hey, you were asking this question about this issue. You may want to follow up and ask about this other thing, or here's some additional information, or just having some more back and forth contact with those committee experts. But that's really the where things get really exciting, is that constructive dialogue in Geneva. Then a few weeks later, the committee experts publish a formal document that's called Concluding Observations and Recommendations. And this document is typically 6 to 10 pages long, and it includes the committee's official report card on how the government has done in complying with its obligations under that particular treaty, and what the government should be doing between this date and the next review better to respect its obligations under that particular treaty. So it's really helpful if the committee experts focus in on the issues we're raising and make recommendations that will help advance the ball to really put pressure on the Iranian government to respect its obligations under that particular treaty. Some of the treaties are easier to talk about the death penalty under because it's sort of a more natural fit. And other treaties, you have to be perhaps a little bit more creative to make the death penalty relevant to what's in the treaty language. But either way, we really hope to have good, solid, strong recommendations to the Iranian authorities related to the death penalty and also related issues like the right to a fair trial and discrimination issues and so on and so forth. Once those concluding observations and recommendations are published, it's really up to the government to implement those recommendations. And Iran, kind of like the United States and many other countries, isn't necessarily particularly diligent at implementing the recommendations, but they're supposed to be implementing those recommendations for the next 4 or 5 years, and then the cycle begins anew. So the government is expected to do another self-audit to say, here's what we've done since the last review, here are the steps we've taken to implement or not to implement the recommendations from the last review, here's the progress we've made, and here's where we're struggling or having some difficulties. And it's a cyclical process. So each cycle builds on the previous one. So that's the treaty body reporting cycle in a nutshell. And I do want to say that, and it comes to mind because of Iran in particular, when civil society organizations engage with the treaty bodies, any NGO can submit written information, and any NGO can attend that public briefing. But the private briefing, the treaty experts get to decide who attends. And we had a very interesting experience in our engagement with the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities a few years back, because there was what we call a gongo, a government organized NGO, a fake NGO, sponsored, funded by the Iranian authorities, that was there in Geneva to participate in this review. And the treaty body experts aren't stupid. They knew that this NGO was fake. And this NGO targeted the advocates for human rights because they knew we were in Geneva. They knew that we had done this report on death penalty issues in Iran. And they tried to befriend us. They weren't very good at being sneaky about it, but they tried to befriend us and started asking us questions about, do you know when the private briefing is? And we just played dumb. We had a very private briefing with just 2 NGOs that the committee experts agreed to meet with, because the other NGOs that had submitted information, it was clear to the experts that they were fake NGOs and they didn't want them to be present during the briefing. So it is interesting that the Iranian government funds these fake NGOs and sends them to Geneva. And to me, that's an indication that, yes, the Iranian authorities do care about their reputation in Geneva. If they didn't care, they wouldn't bother to create and fund these fake NGOs and send them to Geneva to try to improve the reputation. So it's an interesting signal. It's a little disturbing that these organizations exist and that they're trying to sort of infiltrate and spy on other NGOs. But at the same time, it's to me, it's some bit of evidence that what's going on in Geneva is relevant to the government of Iran. So with that, I want to, I think I'll stop sharing my screen right now, and I'll talk about some advocacy that we've done with UN treaty bodies on death penalty issues in Iran. The first one that I want to talk about is one of the most recent examples of advocacy with the with UN treaty bodies, and that's with the committee that is responsible for civil and political rights, and that's called the Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee reviewed Iran's human rights record and its compliance with respect to civil and political rights in exactly 1 year ago. It was on the 9th and 10th of October, 2023. And I hope you all know that the 10th of October is World Day Against the Death Penalty. So we hope that the committee experts were particularly focused on death penalty issues during the review. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the issues we raised in our report, But of course, there are many issues related to the death penalty. What I do want to zoom ahead and focus on is what the committee experts said in their concluding observations and recommendations with respect to the death penalty. In other words, how critical were they? What types of things did they pay attention to? And sort of what came of that review? So what I'd like to do now is share my screen and show you this outcome document, and I'll try to make it big enough, and I'll read some excerpts from it for you to show you what these committee experts said just a year ago about death penalty issues in Iran. So here you see the document, and I'll make it a little bit bigger for you because I understand it's small, but you can see that the document was finally published on November 23rd, so a few weeks after that constructive dialogue. And this was the fourth periodic report. In other words, the fourth round that Iran went with this particular treaty body. And you'll see in the introduction, it gives sort of an overview and talks about positive aspects, because these independent experts do like to have something good to say. And one thing I think is relevant for the death penalty is positive aspect under 3A. The committee gave Iran some praise for adopting an amendment of the law on combating drugs, reducing the punishment for nonviolent drug offenses. And we know that prior to that time, and since then it has increased again, is Iran is one of the handful of countries that authorizes the death penalty for drug-related offenses that are nonviolent offenses. So they're subtly making reference to the death penalty here without explicitly saying it under the positive aspects. But as we go further along in the document, principal matters of concern and recommendations, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, we'll just zip ahead to the death penalty issues that the committee raised specifically. And this falls under the right to life. Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says that no state, no party to the treaty shall arbitrarily deprive any person of their life. It recognizes that the death penalty is a possibility, but it can't be arbitrary. And the committee has given a lot of sort of information about what it means by an arbitrary or non-arbitrary deprivation of life. And here the committee is using for the UN very strong language. It says the committee is deeply concerned by ongoing violations of the right to life, including the number of executions, the increase in executions since 2021, a large number of offenses that carry death sentences but do not qualify as the most serious crimes. And this is a really important aspect of international human rights law. This treaty and these treaty experts have clarified that the death penalty must, if it's going to be in place, it must be reserved for the most serious crimes. That's the official language, and is defined most serious as limited to crimes that involve an intentional killing committed by the person who's potentially going to be sentenced to death. In other words, they needed to be the one who pulled the trigger, who actually committed the killing, and that they intended to kill. Any other crimes are not most serious. And the committee goes on to list in this paragraph 23 a variety of offenses, and this is because civil society organizations like us gave them this information. They didn't come up with it on their own. We shared all this information with the committee experts so they would know exactly what crimes can result in a death penalty, including Kisos offenses that may be unintentional killings. And I'm sorry, my pronunciation is horrible, but Tazir crimes like drug-related offenses. And also another thing the committee raises is the disproportionate application of the death penalty to minority groups, like the ones listed on your screen. And the committee also points out executions for enmity against God and spreading corruption on earth, and expresses concerns about, despite that amendment in 2017 to the drug laws, the number of executions for drug-related offenses increased during the reporting period. There, you may recall there was a significant drop in executions for drug-related offenses, and then it's grown since that time. So the committee had very specific, very accurate information about the status of the death penalty and wasn't going to sort of accept whatever the Iranian authorities said during that constructive dialogue. Another thing the committee pointed out was how minors are treated in conflict with the law. The committee notes that Iran gives differential treatment to minors who commit murder. And what they mean there is that whether a child is a boy or a girl may mean who is eligible for the death penalty, because there's a different because the Iranian government says or thinks that girls mature more quickly, so a younger girl could be sentenced to death when an older boy wouldn't be sentenced to death because purportedly he's not mature enough to know the consequences of his actions. So the committee is pointing out that this is discriminatory, and the committee is also expressing its concern that juveniles continue to be executed, including 3 in 2022. So the committee has very specific information that it is putting on the plate of the Iranian authorities. And it's because organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and Iran Human Rights have shared that information with the committee experts so that they can really turn up the heat on the Iranian authorities. And I should also add, as a matter of international human rights law, it is a violation of international human rights law to execute any person for any offense committed when the person was under the age of 18. The Iranian authorities don't seem to understand that point, because what they tend to do, although they don't do this consistently, what they sometimes do is will wait until that juvenile becomes 18, and then they will carry out the execution. That is not consistent with international human rights law. No person should be executed for any act while they were under the age of 18. And Iranian law is not consistent with international human rights law in that regard. The committee also talks about the absence of fair trial guarantees, the use of coerced confessions, closed proceedings in front of the revolutionary courts, the low standards of evidence required for conviction. You are probably familiar with this sworn oath where a certain number of people, like 50 family members, can swear an oath that somebody committed the crime, even if they have no knowledge of whether they actually committed the crime. And that counts as evidence that can be used to execute someone. Restrictions on attorneys meeting with clients or gaining access to case files, and also reports that families and attorneys are not always informed of executions. And then lastly, the committee regrets the lack of public official disaggregated statistics regarding death sentences. And I'll say this last point about the lack of transparency, the lack of official statistics, is something that is really quite amazing that Iran Human Rights does. Iran Human Rights has fantastic information about executions in Iran, and they spend countless hours documenting those executions, even when they're not publicly announced by the government. And that sort of information is really valuable for doing this kind of advocacy at the United Nations. So that's the description of the concerns in paragraph 23. Paragraph 24 is the recommendations. So these are the official recommendations the committee experts are making to the Iranian authorities, telling them what they should be doing for the next 4 years. And the first thing is, A, ensure the death penalty is never imposed in violation of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, including in violation of fair trial rights, and the position of certainty in the definition of criminal offenses. That's another issue we raised in our report, is a lot of these capital crimes are very vaguely defined. What does it mean to be waging war on earth, or corruption on earth, or waging war against God? These are incredibly vague offenses, and no one can really appreciate or understand whether their conduct falls into those categories. They're kind of catch-all categories that the government uses as a pretext for, we don't like your behavior, and so we're going to charge you with this, and we're going to sentence you to death, and we're going to execute you. So that's another concern that the committee had and is voiced in that recommendation. Another recommendation is to ensure that evidence obtained under duress and torture is inadmissible in court, and that families and attorneys are kept informed about the status of whether an execution is imminent. Also, don't execute juvenile offenders under any circumstance, and then give due consideration to establishing a moratorium on the death penalty, and consider acceding to the treaty that reinforces that abolition of the death penalty. And then finally, point D is collect and make publicly available disaggregated data on the number of death sentences imposed, the gender and age of defendants, the number of executions carried out, pardons and commutations requested, and the types of offense for which the death sentences are imposed. We're really excited about that recommendation D, in part because with Iran Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, we have a women, gender, and the death penalty project, where we're really trying to tease out how many women are under sentence of death, how many women are executed, and getting this type of pressure from UN treaty bodies may be really helpful in trying to tease out some of that information from official sources. There are a lot more recommendations in this document that we don't have time to talk about. We've been going for already for a half an hour, but one thing I wanted to highlight is the committee experts, when they publish this document, they identify priority recommendations. It's usually 2 to 4 priority recommendations, and they say to the government that's being reviewed, we don't want to wait 5 years to hear from you on these recommendations. We want to hear from you in 2 or 3 years. And lo and behold, one of those priority recommendations from the human rights, I did want to highlight also, they made recommendations on the right of peaceful assembly, and note the execution of 7 individuals who were involved in the protests that began in 2022. But with respect to the priority recommendations, they requested by the 3rd of November 2026, in other words, a faster turnaround in 3 years' time, information on implementation of certain recommendations, including all of those recommendations I just covered about the death penalty. So the committee is signaling here that they really are most concerned about these 3 issues, including the death penalty, putting the pressure on the government to provide a written response to those specific recommendations with a faster turnaround than the rest of the recommendations in the document. So this doesn't mean that the government of Iran is going to take these recommendations and do everything that the committee experts say, but it's an example of how we've used the United Nations mechanisms to put pressure on the Iranian authorities and to have these human rights experts in Geneva really let them know what they're concerned about, what's going on, what's being done wrong. And it's a way to kind of amplify the voices of all of those people in those 22 prisons in Iran who are going on hunger strikes every Tuesday. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there because we finished with that one treaty body. But as I mentioned, there are several other treaty bodies we've engaged in advocacy with. And I mentioned already the Gongo, that government-organized NGO that was in Geneva when we were doing advocacy with the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And they did not get in the room. There were just 2 of us NGOs in the room. And you may say, well, it's kind of a hard connection to draw between the death penalty and people with disabilities. But we did, thanks to our collaborations with Iran Human Rights and other NGOs in the diaspora that work on human rights issues in Iran, we were able to gather some information that there were people with psychosocial disabilities and with intellectual disabilities who were being sentenced to death in Iran, and that the judicial proceedings did not accommodate their disabilities. So that was an issue that we raised with the committee. And we also raised an issue that we don't normally raise, but we raised the issue of amputations. Now, amputations, of course, are different from the death penalty, but we were concerned because people were facing amputations for committing certain crimes. And it was a sort of a way that the government was trying to stigmatize people for committing certain crimes, in addition to it being, a form of torture and quite brutal. And it was a really tricky issue to raise with this particular committee, because this committee, as part of its mandate, does not investigate anything related to the causes of disabilities. And I understand that because I don't want to get into, why a person might have a disability. It might, they get into messy discussions about genetic testing and selective abortions and things like that. So they, as a rule, do not talk about the causes of disabilities, including when the government itself intentionally causes a disability with the purpose of stigmatizing a person. So we raised this issue in our written report and behind closed doors, but the committee didn't take that issue up, and we, it was disappointing, but it was not surprising given the committee's overall position. But I do want to share what some of the outputs were from that review, and this will be much shorter because there there isn't as much in that document. This was a review that happened in 2017, and I'll again make this a little bit bigger. So the review happened in 2017, and this was the initial report. This is the first time the Iranian authorities had gone through this process with this particular committee, because they had just ratified this particular convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. But the committee did mention the death penalty, and it's quite unusual for this committee to talk about death penalty issues, but I'll show you where it cuts to that chase. And here it is under Article 10, the right to life. The experts said the committee is concerned that persons with disabilities, particularly persons with psychosocial and or intellectual disabilities, may face a greater risk of incurring the death penalty because of a lack of procedural accommodations in criminal proceedings. So that was the concern. And then they made a recommendation that Iran not accommodate, but take measures to replace the death penalty as a form of punishment and ensure that persons with disabilities are not arbitrarily deprived of their life. Because again, that's the international human rights standard, is the prohibition against arbitrary deprivation of life. And any deprivation of life that is rooted in discrimination is, by definition, arbitrary. So discrimination against people with disabilities that leads to their death sentences is also arbitrary. So it was not a huge victory, but a really, really great to see this treaty body that we don't do a lot of advocacy with taking up the issue of the death penalty. And our goal here is that whenever the Iranian authorities go to Geneva, they're going to hear about the death penalty. They're going to face criticism about the death penalty, that they can't even go to this new committee that focuses on people with disabilities. They're still going to hear about death penalty issues. So it's kind of this repetition, this attack from all fronts that we hope will put pressure on the authorities to let them know, at least, that it's not okay what they're doing, and that in the international human rights world, they will face criticism from all sides for their death penalty practices. So I'll stop sharing there. And I wanted to talk really briefly as well about the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We did this advocacy also quite a while ago. This was in 2016. But I'll share my screen here and you can see what that's all about. Let me make it a little bit bigger. This was in 2016, and we had, with Iran Human Rights, submitted information to these committee experts about death penalty issues in Iran. Now, the Committee on the Rights of the Child is talking about all sorts of things related to the rights of the child, like right to education, the right to be with their families, and so on and so forth. So the death penalty is really a small sliver of what that committee might be interested in. So we were really happy with the coverage that death penalty issues got by this particular committee. And again, they wouldn't be able to do it if Iran Human Rights didn't have that information and didn't get it to the committee experts so that they could talk about it in their constructive dialogue and so they could include it in their concluding observations and recommendations. Let's see. So this paragraph here that is highlighted was interesting because the committee is talking about children belonging to different minority groups. So Baha'i children, Sunni children, children who belong to minority ethnic and linguistic groups, etc. And also the second sentence talks about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex children who face discrimination based on their real or perceived sexual orientation or identity, and that same-sex sexual behavior of adolescents above the current age of criminal responsibility is criminalized and punished with penalties ranging from flogging to the death penalty. So the committee here is highlighting that the death penalty is a possible penalty for same-sex conduct, including for children, including for people who are under the age of 18. So that, I think, was a really useful pressure point for the committee to put on the Iranian authorities. And then further on in the document, there's a lot of information about the death penalty. It's a big part of this set of concluding observations and recommendations. Talking about the right to life, they talk about they talk about this sort of shell game that the Iranian authorities have been playing with the death penalty for juveniles. And they were able to understand this because of the advocacy we did with Iran Human Rights, explaining what otherwise would be a really complicated thing because of the way the Iranian authorities present these issues. So the committee noted Article 91 of the Islamic Penal Code of 2013 that exempts under certain conditions children below the age of 18 from certain punishments involving the death sentence if they don't realize the nature of the crime committed or if there's uncertainty. However, the committee expresses serious concern that these exemptions are under the full discretions of judges. In other words, the judges get to decide whether a person under the age of 18 will face the death penalty or not, and there's no check on that discretion. So while the Iranian authorities like to talk about Article 91, what we as civil society get to shine the light on is how the judges can make that article completely irrelevant. So, and then the committee continues in this paragraph where he's using very strong language. I don't think I've ever seen this in another treaty body review. The committee deplores that the state party continues to execute children and those who have committed a crime while under 18 years of age, despite its previous recommendations and numerous criticisms by human rights treaty bodies. So that's extremely strong language from the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And then if you look at paragraph 36, the committee strongly urges the state party as a matter of utmost priority. So extremely strong language here to end the execution of children, juvenile offenders, abolish the death penalty for people who committed hudud or qisas crimes while under the age of 18, without leaving any discretion to the courts, and commute existing sentences for offenders on death row who committed a crime when under the age of 18. So that was really strong language we were really glad to see. And then there are also a couple of paragraphs here that were interesting. I think we raised these in our report as well, that and we're by no means encouraging the use of the death penalty, but we pointed out to the committee that if a father or paternal grandfather kills their child or grandchild, then they can basically have a lighter punishment. And as the committee says, it's paving the way for total impunity for killing one's child. And for the Committee on the Rights of the Child, that's a really big concern. So the committee encourages the state party to repeal that article for these so-called honor crimes and so on and so forth. So we were really happy with those results as well. And of course, we hope that this will have the result of putting some pressure on Iranian authorities to at least understand that the international community is not satisfied with its death penalty practices and that it needs to take measures to improve. The last treaty body review I'm going to talk about is hot off the presses. This was just issued a couple of weeks ago, and this is our advocacy with the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So you'll see that the concluding observations were issued September 19th of 2024. And here, of course, we talked about racial discrimination in the application of the death penalty in Iran. So you can see that lengthy set of recommendations from this review that just happened in Geneva. And one of the recommendations the committee experts made was to refrain from imposing and carrying out the death penalty. And then with respect to the criminal justice system, the committee expressed its concerns that members of ethnic and ethno-religious minority groups are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, disproportionately subjected to arbitrary detention and sentenced to death for broad and vaguely formulated offenses under the Islamic Criminal Code and for drug-related offenses. And they talk about the lack of fair trial guarantees and make recommendations to repeal the vaguely worded criminal offenses punishable by death, to establish a moratorium on the death penalty, and again, to publish disaggregated statistics on death sentences imposed and executions carried out, including by the type of offense, so we can really learn more about what Iran is exactly doing, because they are not transparent in their practices. So that gives you another sense of how that review took place and what some of the outcomes were relative to the death penalty. So it's the sort of thing we keep chipping away at it, and every time there's an opportunity for a UN human rights body to review Iran's human rights record, I reach out to Mahmoud and Layla and say, hey, is it time to do another report to the UN? And we will pull together a report. We'll get that information in the hands of those committee experts so that they can conduct a really rigorous constructive dialogue and come out with really good, strong concluding observations and recommendations for the Iranian authorities. I see we just have a few minutes left, but I did want to talk about another opportunity for UN advocacy. And this one is really exciting because there's another chance coming up on January 24th at 9 a.m. Geneva time or Central European time. And that's something called the Universal Periodic Review. The Universal Periodic Review, as the name suggests, is a review of every country's human rights record. So all countries go through this process, even if they haven't ratified a single human rights treaty. And it happens every 5 years. So every 5 years, a country is up for review. And this, unlike the other processes that I've been talking about, where it's experts that are doing the review, it's a peer review process. So governments review the human rights record of other governments. And so it's a little bit different. You can understand what some of the dynamics are, and you can imagine when Iran comes up for its review on January 24th next year, which countries are going to be particularly vocal, particularly critical of Iran, and which countries might, not be so critical at all, might say, yes, you're doing a good job, keep up the good work. So this is another opportunity for governments to put pressure on the Iranian authorities through their diplomats. And this site, the Universal Periodic Review, started in 2006. And as the procedure goes on, Iran has been through 3 complete cycles, and it's its 4th cycle that's going to happen in January. The Advocates for Human Rights with Iran Human Rights already submitted our report for this review. It was due in July. So we submitted that report identifying a lot of different human rights issues and concerns relating to the death penalty. And I'll tell you that the first time Iran was reviewed, there were 27 recommendations related to the death penalty. The second and third reviews, there were 41 and 40 recommendations on death penalty issues for Iran. And so we're hoping that with this next review that happens in January, there will be at least 40 more recommendations for the Iranian authorities to consider. It's a way to sort of turn up the heat to say, not only is it these experts that are concerned about death penalty issues in Iran, but it's governments around the world that understand what's happening in Iran, that understand that there are human rights violations that are ongoing in Iran, and will put pressure on Iranian authorities to try to make some changes. One thing that's really interesting about this Universal Periodic Review process is it's a process based on consent. So governments around the world make recommendations, and then the government that receives the recommendations, they have the choice to say yes or no to each recommendation. If they say no, they're under no obligation to do anything further. But if they say yes to a recommendation, then they have until the next review, 5 years later, to implement it, to carry it out. And so if a government accepts a recommendation, they're really making that public promise. They're making a public commitment to do what that recommendation says. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see what the recommendations were that Iran received in 2019 when its third review happened. And the Iranian authorities did, in fact, accept, at least in part, 2 recommendations related to the death penalty. And I'd love to have your insights about why you think Iran did this and what it means. And of course, whether Iran kept its promise and has actually implemented these recommendations. So if you give me just a moment, I will find the right document and share it with all of you. Let's see. Okay, I'm ready to share this one. Okay, I'll make this a little bit bigger so folks can see. So this was the review that happened in 2019. This was the 3rd cycle review. And this is sort of a record of the proceedings. And I went through and another thing that happens, which is the same as with the treaty bodies, is the government delegation in Geneva gives sort of a summary of its report, what it's doing well, and might also sort of respond to some anticipated criticisms. And lo and behold, the Iranian authorities did respond to some anticipated criticisms about death penalty issues. And this is just sort of a verbatim record of what the Iranian authorities said on the world stage in front of all the governments of the world. The Iranian authorities said there had been a veritable judicial renaissance in the Islamic Republic of Iran. For example, alternative forms of punishment were being introduced in some cases, meaning alternatives to the death penalty. And then they talk about the death penalty for juvenile offenders. So if you scroll down to the middle of the paragraph, a different punishment system applied to those under 18 who are no longer subject to the death penalty. Now, we fact-check that. We know that's not true. We know it's up to the discretion of the judges, but they're asserting on the world stage that they're no longer subject to the death penalty. Instead, juvenile offenders could be detained in correctional centers for up to 5 years. And then it gives some information about amnesty. Between 2015 and 2018, 1,755 people sentenced to death had been pardoned. So that's a good thing. We like those pardons, but they knew going in that they were going to face some criticisms for the death penalty. And then I just want to show you sort of the sheer volume of recommendations that Iran received on death penalty issues in 2019. As I said, there were 40 recommendations, and I'll scroll. I highlighted them all for you so you can see there's where they begin. And you can see which countries are making these recommendations. So Switzerland, Poland, Portugal, Moldova, Ukraine, and it's everything from establish a moratorium on executions, abolish the death penalty for juvenile offenders, but a variety of things. Uruguay, Belgium, Albania made 2 recommendations, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Chile. But I'm putting a red arrow by the 2 recommendations I want to talk about because these are recommendations that Iran rejected all the other recommendations. But for these 2 recommendations, Iran accepted them in part. So one is from Cyprus: reduce the number of offenses punishable by death, commencing with drug-related offenses, as well as prohibit the use of the death penalty against those who were minors at the time the crime was committed. So it's kind of a compound 2-part recommendation. Not clear which part Iran accepted. And then the other one is 26.118 by Spain: continue reforms to the penal code in order to restrict the death penalty to the most serious crimes, which would be progress toward the full abolition of the death penalty. So those are the 2 recommendations that Iran accepted in part without telling us what exactly. And so it makes it a little bit challenging to figure out, did they implement it? Did they do any of that? And by my count, they haven't done any of those recommendations, even though they made that promise in 2019. Nobody was forcing their hand. They voluntarily agreed to do those things and have not done them. So that's going to be a big part of the discussion on January 24th, when the Iranian authorities return to Geneva for their next review. So you can see there's lots and lots of recommendations, including political recommendations that might be seen as more politicized, like a recommendation from Israel to end the widespread use of the death penalty, especially on minors, but also from a variety of countries, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America and in Oceania as well. So those are the recommendations that Iran received. And the official response that Iran gave in its addendum was fairly cryptic because let me show this document. This is the addendum, sort of the official response that the Iranian authorities gave in February 2020. And with respect to those recommendations, of course, it lists the recommendations that it supported, and then it says partially supported recommendations. It just lists those 2. For some of them, it explains why, like what's partially supported, but it doesn't explain for those. There's no explanation. And then not supported recommendations are all of those other recommendations on the death penalty. So they opted not to accept most of those recommendations, but those 2, for some unknown reason, the Iranian authorities agreed to accept. And so that opens the door at least to say, okay, you agreed to do this. What have you done? You made this commitment. You didn't have to. What have you done? And where are we going forward? So that'll be an interesting part of the advocacy. And as I mentioned, it's a way for all of you to get involved, because countries around the world have the chance to take the floor again on January 24th. And you can be a part of that advocacy effort with the permanent missions to the UN offices in Geneva to encourage them to take up death penalty issues when they take the floor on the Human Rights Council on January 24th. It's something that the Advocates for Human Rights works with Iran Human Rights on, but it's the sort of thing where we send out more than 100 emails to targeted delegates to the Human Rights Council that we think will be receptive to our information. And so it's the sort of thing, if you're based in Europe, you have the chance to go and hold meetings. That's another way that you as regular folks can exert, have your voices be heard and exert your influence to try to turn up that pressure on the Iranian authorities with respect to the death penalty. So I've been yammering on for a very long time. It looks like we have 3 minutes to go in my 1 hour commitment, but I'm happy to respond to questions or talk about anything else in more detail. I'm really grateful for all of you for your attention and also for the chance to collaborate with Iran Human Rights and other organizations that are really focused on human rights issues in Iran, particularly with respect to the death penalty. So it's an honor for me to be a part of that advocacy. And it's the sort of thing that we couldn't do without all the hardworking people who are gathering that information and explaining it to people like me who don't speak Farsi and can't understand, what kisas is or what, corruption on earth means. It's really a great collaboration, and we're immensely grateful for that opportunity to do what we know how to do, which is use the UN to try to put pressure on the Iranian authorities.
Thank you very much, dear Amy. There is a question for you from Negar. Okay. Go ahead, Negar, but please, because the time is over, very quick question and quick answer. Negar.
Thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure for giving us hope as well. So thank you. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you. I was wondering what would be the next step. So if the Islamic Republic is neglecting and dismissing these recommendations of UNHRC again and again, I was wondering then would it eventually give Iranians the opportunity to take a case against the Islamic Republic to ICC? What would be the next step, or what would be your recommendation of the best next step? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And I think we wish that these human rights mechanisms were stronger, that we could send in a police force or do something that has more teeth than what we do, which is to just keep going at it, keep using the mechanisms we have. But there's no real enforcement mechanism. The International Criminal Court doesn't get involved just because a country doesn't follow through on the recommendations it receives. There's no way to do that. It's really a matter of continuing to put pressure on the authorities and continue to remind them that we're not going to remain silent. Just because the Iranian authorities don't do what the UN says doesn't mean we just, walk away from the UN and let them do whatever they want at the UN. We want the Iranian authorities always to know that when they go to the UN, they're going to hear about this. The UN experts are going to have accurate information at their fingertips, and they are going to turn up the heat. Just like the people in the prisons are turning up the heat through their hunger strikes, and just like all of you who are outside of Iran are turning up the heat through your different channels, they are going to continue to feel that pressure, and it will not last. We know from history, it's not going to last. We don't know when it's going to end, but the authorities it's not sustainable. We just don't know when it's going to happen, and we know we have to continue to put pressure from whatever angles we can to hasten that end of the current regime.